I'm not, when I heard Neil say that I was going to give an introduction to focusing therapy or focusing oriented therapy, I immediately wanted to object. Um, although, I mean, you're not wrong, I probably promised that, but to learn how to integrate focusing into your work as a therapist does take a little bit of time.
Mm.
So in 90 minutes, I'm hoping you will hear enough about this way of working that you will know if you want to hear more. You will know if it's interesting to you. I'm hoping that it will give you a way of carrying forward into your work and into your lives somehow. It doesn't have to be through focusing, but something that's experiential. From my point of view, something that is experiential and phenomenological rather than just experiential, or sometimes what is just phenomenological. And we can hear a question coming on that distinction. But let me just say a few things about focusing oriented therapy. Eugene Gendlin, the philosopher that first described this process, he didn't invent it, he just described it. And then I would like it if we could do something experiential, because that's the only way you will really understand what I'm hoping to point towards. You won't really understand it from me. If I just talk and then I ask for questions, we'll end up in a conceptual discussion and we will miss the whole point of what I'm wanting to convey to you. Then after the experiential time, then I would like to open it up for questions, feedback, anything you want to say. The reason I do it in that order is because once you've had an experience, you'll have very different questions. And I also will be able to give you answers that point towards your experience, point towards something that actually has happened in life, rather than just something that we can think up. That's an important distinction from my point of view. I remember speaking with Gendlin many years ago, and I came up with a hypothetical. I was trying to give him trouble on the question of choice. And I came up with a hypothetical situation. And he just looked at me and he said, "Has that ever happened?" And I thought, well, no, not that I know of, but it was interesting. He could tell the difference. So there's many things we can think up that will never happen. So let's try to ground our discussion and our thinking in at least a moment of lived experience, something that's actually occurred. Okay. I'm going to change the view. I'm just finding it distracting to see people popping up all the time. I think I might, if I change it to the speaker, then I'll see myself, and I don't want that, definitely. I'll cope with this. So let me just see what I'm doing right now. This is focusing. I'm pausing. I'm not just stuck. I'm not just lost. I'm actually pausing in order to ask myself what should come next. What do I feel like I really need to say? I don't want to go on just saying everything I can think of. So I'm just pausing to ask myself what should come next. Is there anything else I really feel like I need to say to you before we try it? I want to say just a little bit about Eugene Gendlin. He was an American philosopher, died in 2017, I think. Originally from Austria. His whole philosophy, he was a philosopher, not a psychologist, although for his whole academic life, he had a joint appointment in philosophy and psychology. he was interested in how it's possible for a human being to go from their experience into their symbolizing of experience. How is it possible to go from all of the implicit experience that we feel bodily into words, images, gestures, some kind of symbolizing of that experience? That's his whole philosophical work. It's something so fundamental and so close to our living that it's a little bit shocking to see somebody kind of make it stand out and try to talk about it. He joined Carl Rogers way back in the 50s because he thought in the person-centered therapy that was one place where he could actually study this. He was the kind of philosopher that wanted to do research, not just sort of abstract thinking. So he joined that research group and started to look at what was actually happening in these therapy sessions. And what he found was, the whole research team found, not just him, was that about a third of the clients were getting the change they wanted from therapy, not because of the skill of the therapist necessarily, but because of what they were doing inside of themselves. Those clients that were getting the change they wanted, they would actually pause and pay attention to their own experiencing. They would say something and then they would check it with themselves and correct it if they didn't quite say it right. They would check to see if it actually resonated with their experience. Those clients were very likely to get at least some important change out of their therapy. The clients that weren't doing that were just talking, that didn't pause to check whether what they were saying was accurate with what they actually had experienced, those clients were much less likely to get the change they wanted. So Jandlin and his graduate students became very curious about that process. What are those people actually doing? They didn't learn it in therapy. They were doing it in therapy. They didn't learn it from their therapists. Jandlin was interested in psychotherapy, but if he was interested in golfing or in poetry, he probably would have found exactly the same process there. It's not some strange therapeutic technique. But what they were uncovering and paying attention to was something about what a human being is. What they found was that they could describe this process very simply. And then they tried to teach it to people. And when they tried to teach it to people, what they discovered was that most people found that they were relearning something that they had originally known and just lost touch with at some point in their living. That teaching was Jandlin's original little focusing book that's sold millions of copies around the world. And in that book, he had 6 little steps that are just meant to point you back towards your own bodily experiencing. And according to Jandlin, once you find your way back, so that you're back in your body, back in touch with your experience, then you throw the steps away. He never meant for that to be some kind of a stepwise process or some kind of a technique. He meant that just to be of some help to people, to find themselves again. And once they found themselves, to just let go of that map. So that's one of the important things I want to say, is that focusing is not a technique. Focusing is attention to how the body implicitly is living our life situations. If you pay attention to the body, what you find is information about your lives. You don't find information about some strange cut-off subjectivity. You find you're living in the world. You find your being in the world. You find your relationships with other people. You find the strange ways that you are in certain situations. You go into the body, you find out more of the world. not about just yourself, as though there is such a thing as a self closed off from the world. It's a totally natural process. You will also find, we'll see if you'll find, that the feelings in the body have the ability to process themselves further. One very good example of that is the experience of having forgotten something. Everybody I've ever met knows that experience of, I know I've forgotten something. It's that nagging feeling in the pit of your stomach as you walk out the door on the way to work and you know, I've forgotten something. You go through a whole list of things and now you've got all of those things. Halfway to work, you remember. You forgot a report that you needed for work that day or something like that. How do you know if it was the thing that you forgot? Because it comes like this. It's like, oh, that's what it was. You know immediately. Your whole body goes, yeah, that's what it was. In that moment, the body releases. The body lets go. It's like it's been nagging at you all the way to work, trying to tell you, you've forgotten this thing, you've forgotten this thing, you've forgotten this thing. You might even remember something else you forgot. You forgot your sunglasses, but the body still is holding on. And then you know, okay, I did forget my sunglasses, but that's not it. The body can make that kind of feeling about almost anything we're living. And once you understand it, once you pay attention to it, I would say you pay attention to it phenomenologically. Attempt to just describe it, just sit with it, just feel it, just relate to it. If you do that, sooner or later, the feeling starts to reveal what it's trying to tell you, or what it's about in your life, what it is that you haven't been paying attention to, something like that. And how do you know when you have understood it? Exactly the same. There's a deep breath. Sometimes there's tears. Sometimes there's laughter. There's some bodily resonance or recognition that, oh yeah, that's what it was. Or that's what I'm doing. Or that's why it bugs me so much. Or that's the right way forward. The body releases. And it's kind of, it's as though the body indicates to you, okay, this is the right direction. Now you're back on track. Now you've understood something. It does that naturally. We all know that just from the way we live. The problem from my point of view is that we rarely pay attention to it. Most of us live out of touch with that bodily information, if you want to call it that. And we're not encouraged to be in touch with it, even in therapy. Even in therapy, a lot of therapy is giving things to the client conceptually, the client telling us stories. Unless you know the importance of this bodily experiencing, we have a tendency to run right over top of it and not pause long enough for it to become a part of the session. So let me just open it up and see at this point. I've said some things that might have been provocative for you. So I want to just see if there's any questions, comments at this point, and then we'll go on. But let me just pause and see if there's anything here.
I have a question, actually.
Okay.
So may I ask, so who is the one to recognize the importance of the bodily sensation and the embodied awareness? Therapist, I'm understanding, right? It well, the therapist is the one who will guide towards, no? Or the client needs to develop such a skill or maturity about knowing herself or himself.
The client is the one who knows. The client is the one who understands. The therapist is usually the one who gets in the way, and I'm wanting to encourage us not to do that. But I think you're saying maybe the client needs to be guided to realize that this is important. It is worth staying with the feeling in the body. Is it something more like that you're asking?
Yes, yes. I'm just very curious about the process because I believe it's co-created. It's not purely related only to client or to therapist or to...
That's a more sophisticated point. I agree with you. I think if you work in this way, you have to start questioning whether there is such a thing as a separate therapist and a separate client. In that sense, it's co-created, not in some conceptual way, of course. It's co-created because you're in each other's presence. And the body tells you about your living. So if you're sitting in a room with another person, you're living with that person. And both ways, both people are living with each other. You are each other's environment. You are affecting each other. But you're right, this is your question, you're right that it's usually the therapist who has to say, what are you feeling right now? Or it looks like you're feeling something. Can we just slow down and be with that? The client is more likely to not pay attention to that or not think that you would be interested in it quite often. So if the client starts to realize that their therapist is interested in these subtle little feelings that the client could easily ignore and just go on with the story, then the client's more likely to become interested in those feelings themselves. But it usually originates with the therapist. Unless you have a client that just knows these feelings are important, then sometimes they need to teach their therapist to be quiet and wait so that they can get in touch with what their feeling is trying to tell them. It can happen either way.
And it can be also very figural, like, for example, trembling. And I just wonder, what is the moment that the client realized, oh, this is what it is about, you know?
Well, let me ask you, let's not talk about clients as though they're a different species. Let me ask you, how do you know? How do you know when you've understood a feeling in your body?
For me, it's a very important context. So it's related to what I'm talking about. It's related to ability to self-regulate or lack of it. Yeah. So in other words, staying present, or am I losing it, this ability?
Okay. So let me see if I've understood you. So this is what we would do in focusing when someone is trying to explain something to us. Or hopefully in therapy this happens. We want to say it back to them to see if we've understood them. So I want to say back to you so that I know I haven't understood you, so I'm going to say it back to you as though I have, so that you can correct me, okay?
Sure.
You have this example of like shaking, like having a fever or trembling, that kind of example. First of all, I want to say that's not the kind of bodily feeling I'm normally talking about, but let's take it as an example. And you're saying there's something about the setting where that happens that's important to you. And you're also saying there's something about self-regulating that's an important part of remaining present to the feeling. Is that right?
Yes, yes. And the story I'm telling, yes. So it's more than a setting.
Okay, and the story you're telling, yes. So I would say, from my point of view, you're pointing out some really important things. First of all, if a person is telling a story and they start shaking when they're telling a story, that's a very particular kind of bodily event. I would assume that inside of them they have a feeling. They aren't just shaking without any feeling. So I would want to pay attention to actually what's the feeling, especially in the middle part of the body. That's normally where these feelings come. And then you talk about self-regulation. If I've understood you, the way I would talk about that is about coming into relationship with the feeling.
Yes.
Yes. So if we want to work phenomenologically, I think we want to come into relationship with the feeling. There has to be some degree of safety, some degree of grounding, some degree of being able to be with it, not be in it. It's not just abreaction or catharsis or something. It's actually a way of being with it so that we can learn from it. We can be in relationship with it. That's important. I think that's what you're calling self-regulation. Yeah, that is important. We'll see when we'll try something. When we try that, I think you'll get a sense of what I mean by that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I appreciate this.
Thank you. Anything else before we try it? Especially if there's anything in the way. If there's anything you're sitting there going, no, no way, then I would like to hear about that because that will get in the way of you actually being able to kind of open up and pay attention to yourself. Okay, everybody's open to this. Okay, that's great. That's great. That's a nice change. In my experience, in the past, I used to teach at Regent's College, and I would have so many people arguing with me about how it's not possible to pay attention to the body or pay attention to a feeling or something. And I would say, well, have you tried it? So let's just try it and see what happens. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to agree with anything Jensen says. You don't have to know anything. You don't have to be a psychotherapist. You don't have to be a psychologist. In fact, what I would encourage you to do for the next few minutes is to set aside everything you know and think you know about yourself, about what a body is, about feelings, about what is possible, what isn't possible, about how time works, about what life is. Just see how much of that you can just set aside for a few minutes. If it comes creeping in, you can just thank the thought, the concept, whatever, and then let it go again. For now, you're not going to need any of that. So if you know a lot about trauma or some other way of working, for now, I would encourage you to set it aside. We're not saying it's wrong, but just for now, you won't need that. Okay. So what I will do is I will guide you in a very light way, in a very simple way, to invite your attention to come down into your body. If at any point I'm suggesting you do something that doesn't feel right to you, then just ignore me. This whole way of working, it's very gentle. You're not pushing. You're not trying to make anything happen at all. It is simply a very gentle way of being with yourself. So you're looking for the sense that, yeah, this feels okay for me. This feels all right. This maybe even feels good in some way. So please don't follow my instructions if they don't feel right for you. That sense of rightness inside of you is much more important than anything I would say or anyone else would say. Near the end, I would encourage you to find a very gentle way to let it settle. And I'll guide you a little bit in that, but it's important, even in, maybe this will be 20 minutes or something, maybe less. Even in such a short period of time, it's not uncommon to make contact with a part of yourself that perhaps you haven't been paying attention to, maybe for decades. And if something like that comes up, so that you can pay attention to it for 15, 20 minutes, it can sometimes feel really important from the feelings point of view, which sounds a bit odd, to know that you could find it again if you wanted to. That it's waited, maybe 10 years for your attention, and it might want to know that you could actually come back and find it again. And this is the beginning of you actually curious about this part of yourself, or respecting it, or wanting to learn from it. So we want to end in a way that feels respectful to whatever you've been in touch with, whatever part of yourself. Just checking to see if there's anything else that I feel like I need to say before we start this. I don't think so. I think we can just start. So I want to say again, on the one hand, let yourself be surprised. And on the other hand, nothing special has to happen. So just, you don't need to have any kind of agenda. We're not pushing for anything. So I would encourage you to just get comfortable, whether you're sitting or laying or standing. Check that you're comfortable enough, and you can move at any point. You don't have to sit still. There's no rules to this. If you meditate, I would suggest you maybe sit in a slightly different position, just as a way of kind of signaling to yourself that this is a kind of contemplative sort of practice, but it's not like meditation. It's different. Okay. Most people like to close their eyes. One last thing before we start this. What I will be doing is guiding you in a way to just be in relationship with your own feeling, your own experience. I'm doing this, all of you at once. This isn't the way that it would come up in therapy. I'm not suggesting for a moment that you would say to your clients, close your eyes, get comfortable, and then spend 20 minutes guiding them through some kind of a process. That's not how this shows up in therapy. But it is a very good way of finding it again for yourself. So that's all I want to offer. If you want to work in a way that's experientially sensitive, you need to be there yourself. You need to be in your body, in touch with your experiencing. Otherwise, it's just going to be something you do to someone. And this is much more a way of being with someone. First of all, a way of being with yourself, and then a way of being with others. So you really need to be down in there yourself before you can work this way. So again, that's what we're just going to spend a few minutes experiencing. So getting comfortable, closing your eyes if you want to. If you don't like to close your eyes, you can just stare at something neutral. You can turn your camera off if that adds to your sense of privacy, or whatever helps. Just take a couple of deep breaths. And breathe away everything that I've been talking about. Just taking a couple of breaths to sort of settle into your physical body a little bit. Just inviting your awareness to include your body, just your head, but your whole body. Your shoulders, your arms, your back, sitting bones, your legs, all down to your feet, just your whole body. Noticing your posture, your position, and just checking that you're as comfortable as you can be. Just loosening anything that's a little too tight or shifting your position if you need to. And then I would like to invite you to begin to let your attention come down to the whole middle part of your body, where you actually feel the things that are going on for you. You might find that your attention wants to come down into the throat area. You might find your attention wants to come down into your chest somewhere. Find your attention wants to come down into your stomach. Deeper down into your abdomen somewhere. Just taking some time to really invite your attention to be down in there somewhere, so that you're kind of feeling the middle part of your body from the inside. It could be other areas of your body, but it's usually the middle where these kinds of feelings come. So not up in your head looking down, but actually letting your attention be right down in there, and feeling yourself from the inside. And then when you're down in there somewhere, just kind of asking down into your body, not into your head, but actually down into the middle somewhere. How am I right now? What does it feel like to be me right now? And just notice if a feeling begins to form as if in response, kind of a tightness or a jumpiness or kind of a burning, subtle cloudiness. Could be a kind of tiredness. Just see what comes in response down in your body. When you ask down in there, what does it feel like to be me right now? Like, how am I this evening? Something comes and starts to stand out a little bit as if in response. See if you can welcome it. You don't have to understand it. It may be subtle, maybe the kind of feeling you can easily ignore. But this time, see if you can just welcome it. Like, what is it really like to be me now? What's it feel like? And the feeling that comes. Just let it have some space to be there. Don't try to figure it out. Just welcome it like you would a guest someone that's just shown up at your house or something, and feeling with a little bit of gentleness. And just let it have some space to be there. And for a minute or so, just give it your whole attention. Nothing else you have to do, nothing you have to think. Just give this feeling your whole attention. Just notice how it responds to getting your attention. And then maybe seeing if there's a word, a phrase, an image, something that would just describe the quality of this feeling. Excited, could be anything. Or a better way of asking into the body is like, how would this feeling want to describe itself? If it could. What sort of images would really resonate with the way it feels? Sometimes you need to twist words a little bit to get them to really fit the quality of the feeling. If at any point it feels like the feeling is a little bit too much, just kind of back up from it a little bit. To be able to be with it, sort of in it. If you can get a word or phrase or image or something that seems to describe it, just check with the feeling to see if whatever came to you sort of resonates. Almost like you're asking the feeling inside, is that close? Does that capture it? There'll be a little feeling that comes that kind of lets you know, yeah, that's close enough. It's like, yeah, that fits good enough. And if not, just wait for something a little bit closer to come and take a little while. Just what does this really feel like? And then just staying in touch with the feeling like you are. This might sound a bit odd, but just acknowledge it. Just kind of send the message right into the feeling that you know it's there. It's like it's another person and you're just saying, hello. Just to kind of start a relationship between you and this part of you. It really matter to feeling that somebody in the whole world actually knows it's in there. just staying in touch with the feeling like you are. If it feels okay, just invite the feeling to let you know how it's feeling from its side. Like it might be in there with its own emotion, its own mood, its own attitude about things. So almost like it's another person. How is this part of you actually feeling from its point of view? Sad, frustrated, quite trusting your attention, excited that you're paying attention. Could be anything. How is it feeling in there from its point of view? Different from how you're feeling. How is it feeling? If you can get a sense of how it's feeling, like you would with a client, just let it know that you hear that. Getting your patient or your little whatever it is. Just let it know that you hear. Like you're reading the relationship. It's how it feels about being understood at least a little bit. And there's just a couple more things that I would invite you to just check if the feeling wants somehow to be asked these things. The first one is maybe just to ask the feeling if there's anything that it needs. Is there anything that this part of you, this feeling inside, needs to feel a little more in some way? Could be anything. So it needs you to know, needs to be different. It doesn't have to be possible, it can still need it. So don't argue with it. If you get a sense of what it needs, just let it know that you hear that. Like, okay, that's what you need. The last thing you could just check with the feeling before we let it settle for now is if it feels okay, just check with this feeling you're in touch with. Is there any sense of how this connects to my life? You might already know that. But if you don't know it, sometimes you can just ask, like, what in my life just feels like this? What in my life just brings a feeling like this for me? It could be anything. Just notice where the feeling is in your body. It might have changed since when you first noticed it. Maybe notice if there's an image, a word, a memory, something that still kind of resonates with it. Something that's kind of a good symbol for this, so that you could use the symbol to find it again. Just bring it to mind and see if the feeling comes. See if there's any word or image or something that resonates with how it feels right now. So noticing where it is in your body, having a word, an image, something like that. Those two things are usually enough to be able to find your way back here again if you want to continue to get to know this place. But for now, see if it's okay to begin to just expand into the whole person that you are, more than any one place, even if it feels like an important part of you. Again, just getting a sense of yourself sitting on the chair or expanding into a whole person. You really still feel this place, that's fine, but it's within the context of all of you. And then when you're ready, you can begin to make your way back to the room. If they're closed. Turn on the camera if it was off. You don't have to rush that. And I would also say, if anything occurred to you that felt kind of important or curious or something you want to just mull over, feel free to just make a note of it just for yourself, just so that you know that you won't forget that thing. I think that was about 20 minutes, maybe a little bit more. So as you're kind of coming back, let me just say a couple of things. If you were able to invite your attention into your body, that's a very good sign. A lot of people have trouble with that. So if you couldn't do that, don't be discouraged. It's not easy to do that all the time. If you were able to invite your attention in your body and actually feel something and stay with the feeling for even a couple of minutes, then you were focusing. Focusing is just staying with a clearly felt feeling in the body, but a feeling that's unclear. It's like you couldn't easily describe it, but it is clearly felt. If you were with something like that, then you were focusing, even if nothing else came. Even if you couldn't get a word or an image to describe it, even if you had no sense of what it was feeling emotionally, even if nothing else came, you were still focusing. You can't control what else comes from it. This is only 20 minutes. So some people, you need at least 20 minutes just to get your attention into your body. So I'd be curious to hear anything anyone wants to say, questions, comments, feedback, anything you want to share. And if it's okay with you, I would use the opportunity to teach a little bit more about this process from your experience.
I'd be happy to share if there's no other volunteers. Could you remind me again, Greg, whether you wanted me to share like our my experience, kind of what went on a bit for me, and then kind of you're going to do some teaching about that, or based on that, or what would you?
Yeah. At this point, I'm curious to hear anything about what happened or didn't happen. Any questions that arise from that, things you found difficult, things you found easy, things you found interesting, things you just couldn't do, things you thought, why the heck is he asking me to do that? Anything. If you want to make more general points, that's okay too, but I really like for you to talk a little bit about your experience. If you're willing to, you don't have to say what it connects to in your life. You can keep that totally private if you want
Yeah.
to. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, I have had a tiny little bit of experience focusing at one of your weekend events before, which for anyone that hasn't experienced it, they're really well worth attending if you're still running them. But so it's not the first time, and it's the first time in a long time. And for me, it was a really intense moment that I was not expecting just now. I had focused in really deeply to a very, very tense feeling within the middle of my body, which I was checking in whether I was telling you, earlier that I was very cold. I'm very cold in my environment right now. So I'm trying to assess and found that it was not related to that. And the more that I kind of stayed connected with that tense feeling, I was very more aware that it wasn't because I'm physically cold in my environment. And it was really tense and made me really nauseous. And I was very kind of had to step away. You said step away at exactly the right moment for me. I felt very sick, and then gave myself some space from it. And then for me, the imagery was coming really strong, very dark, kind of abstract imagery with the feelings of anger and fury, very, very big anger and fury feelings. And it's interesting for me. I wonder, because at the beginning you said maybe you will, you have a chance to stumble upon something that you haven't visited for years. And I think it's interesting because that was somewhere within me during that whole process for me, because I think it's not the first time I've done some form of exercise where I've stumbled across this anger and fury, which is so opposed to the person that I tried to be and allow myself to be and be for others and support others to be in daily life. I try to be very much about love and compassion. And yet for me, I guess the biggest information that I got from this experience was how vibrant that anger and fury still lives inside me. But interestingly, also, it did occur to me while I was doing this exercise just now that it also comes to me in my dreams. And I wonder if accessing that kind of similar state, and I would love to know whether that is kind of common when you're working with people in this way, whether, for me, I obviously access that in my dream state every night, but I managed to find a way of kind of letting go of that every morning as well. But yeah, that was a connection that I also made, and I think I'll stop there.
Okay, you've said a lot of really important things. I mean, it sounds like a very important experience for you. I want to answer some of the things that you've kind of suggested and some of the things that you did in your experience. And I also want to just start with the last thing. If you pay attention to your dreams experientially, then you would find this, it sounds like. And tonight, unexpectedly, you found it quite directly. And you noticed, I want to just say some of it back to you and then say a little bit about what I could suggest. The first thing is that normally if somebody is working in this way, if it's a client, for example, they're working with a therapist, so I would be sitting across from you. And if you were to say to me, I notice this really tense place in the middle of my body, and it's extreme in some way, it's very intense. The first thing that I would say is, well, let's give it some space. Because if you give a feeling some space, it's like you're allowing the feeling to come the way it wants to come. It often comes a little bit cramped up. And giving it space, it can usually kind of expand a little bit more. It usually becomes a little bit more subtle, a little more sort of holistic in a way, and much easier to relate to. So if we were working together, I might have suggested that, and you might have said, I don't want to give it space, or, whatever. You could have said anything back to me, and I would have been guided by that. But the intensity of the feeling is usually part of the message of the feeling. And you got a couple of words, anger and fury, that it sounds like they resonated with what you were feeling. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And the word tension. That's interesting. The word tension is kind of feeling it from the outside. And anger and fury is more sensing it from the inside. Once you sense a feeling a little bit from the inside like that, then you can begin to have a relationship with it. You can say things to that feeling in the middle of your body. Okay, I know how angry and furious you are. You just acknowledge it exactly as it is without trying to change it at all. And then you can sort of sit down next to it without getting too close and just be with it, like you would be with a client. You just be with the feeling and allow the feeling to begin to reveal more of itself. In order to do that, this for me is very phenomenological. You stay with the description, you don't interpret it, you don't try to fix it, you don't analyze it, you don't explain it, you just describe it. You treat it as if you want to understand it the way it understands itself. Sounds odd. Do you want to say something?
If that's okay, in the sense that there's, for me, a different, like strongly a differentiation between sitting with it as if it's a client and as it is now. Because for me, when you said that in the exercise and when you said it there, it was so impatient, it was so furious kind of at me of,
Yes.
I'm here, so good for you for recognizing that.
Okay.
I'm here now while you're doing this nice exercise, but that I'm here, and it feels so.
So there's more information that you can
Yeah.
again kind of reflect back to the feeling. It's like, okay, I get it. You're actually very impatient. And you're impatient because I know you're in there. And yet, in some way, I'm not acknowledging you. Because you said something important at nearer the end. You were talking about your attitude towards it. If I was working with you, if you're a client of mine, for example, I would say, okay, so there's two feelings. There's this intense, angry, furious, impatient place that wants to be acknowledged as it is. And there's the part of you that is intent on not having anger. And we acknowledge both of those. That's important, because if we want to work with a feeling in a respectful way, we can't be approaching it with any kind of bias. So we need to acknowledge the agenda as well. It's like there's something there that also doesn't want anger. It wants all of those very wonderful positive qualities. So can we be with both of those places? Yeah. Then suddenly it begins to change. There's more space for it to kind of be welcome And probably it begins to calm down slightly. It doesn't have to be quite so intense if it's actually being allowed to be there on its own terms. And this other place that says it doesn't like it can also be there on its own terms. You don't have to be in a conflict. Does that feel different to you?
Yes, absolutely. And I realized something really significant was that anger has not had a place in the last year since I finished my studying. It's only rarely had a place, which I think is why it's been kind of locked up into and only able to come out in the dream place for me. Because prior to that, for maybe a decade, but definitely in the last 4 years, I was writing my thesis on trauma and sexual violence and this, and like there was so much place for that anger to fuel my motivation. And now that the project is no longer here, I've just been flatlined for the last year with this kind of intention of being compassionate and loving, and I've been meaningfully engaging with client work and nature, but apart from that, nothing. But there was a place for that anger. There is a place for that anger.
So this is a part of you that's looking for a place in your life. And I would say this is going further than what you've said, so I'm happy to be wrong. I would say it's angry because it's not getting any place in your life. Yeah. It's just looking for a way to live.
Yeah.
It knows it's supposed to be included in your life somehow.
Because all of them are, right? All of our emotions are.
Well, maybe. I'm just aware, there's a teaching moment there, because now I'm saying a lot more than Natalie's actually said. And I'm guessing. I'm sensing for what's implied in this feeling. What's actually implied but hasn't been said. And I'm saying it, waiting to be corrected. Now I can see that at least some of that resonates with you.
And you setting the parameters in the way that you have, not just with me but throughout the session, invites me to definitely feel safe and comfortable that if it didn't resonate, I would feel that it was beneficial to correct you, as it were, to translate it in a way that felt like it resonated more. But in this case, it did resonate.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that, because if we're working in this way, we want to be guided by the experience. I have no investment in being right. I don't care about being right. My only investment is that it continues to resonate inside of the person. And that's interesting, because it shows us that there is an experiencing process in the person that we can be guided by. We do not need to be guided by theory or technique. I don't know what this is about in this case for this person. I don't need to know. I don't know how it should change. I don't know how to make it change. I don't need to know any of those things. All I'm doing is keeping a person company while they keep themselves company. And we're being guided by then what comes alive and what happens. And something happens. If I started to try to change Natalie and tell her how she should be different, this process would stop. We'd get into another process. If she's polite, she would agree with me. And then she'd go and tell all of her friends, well, my therapist says blah, 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 but nothing would change. So now I'm curious, what do the rest of you think? I've said more now, there must be more to respond to. I'm curious still about your experiences as well.
Greg, may I ask, so when the change occur, because you mentioned nothing would change. So actually, when the change is arriving.
The change, even getting the right word, is a change in the physical body.
So the resonance, yes, we've been.
Yeah. If something resonates, that's already a change. It's all the little steps of change that come. Like Natalie and I had a little interaction, and there's little moments, you could see little moments of things shifting for her. Those are moments of actual change. That's where the body is kind of living itself slightly differently, living itself forward in some way. As you know from your philosophy, most existentialists think of the being as a verb. This is an example of that the human being is a process, is a verb, it's not content. It's this ability to live itself forward into the future. So those are the moments of change. Sometimes the moment of change can be a big insight and the person laughs hysterically or bursts into tears or just breathes really deeply and just goes, oh my God, that's what it is. But sometimes it's a little more subtle. It's just these little moments of getting the right word, getting a little bit different understanding. But yeah, those moments of change, those little steps of unfolding, fall. And they don't come from me, and they don't come from a theory. They come from living.
Mhm.
This is what existence is. Existence does this.
If I may quickly share my experience, I
Mhm.
became at some point lethargic,
Mhm.
and I just became also aware that through life and over the years, in distressing situations, it's kind of my bodily signal almost. Uh, I have symptoms of kind of almost immediately falling asleep or something like that. So I'm not sure it's disconnection, is dissociation, or it's the opposite. It's kind of really the polarity to it is really kind of following the experience of the body. Yeah.
What I would encourage is that you don't interpret it.
All right. Mhm.
You're coming up with a lot of different possible interpretations,
Mhm.
some of which could be right. Who knows? But if they are right, you would get that feeling of resonance. And I didn't see that when you were interpreting it.
Mhm.
But what I would suggest trying instead is just being very phenomenological towards it. When you sit down, you can get this feeling of lethargy or tiredness or whatever. And that's quite common. People often get that. And at least you're assuming it might have some meaning. Yeah, a lot of people don't. A lot of people think, oh, I'm just tired. It's early evening, it's time for me to rest, and I'm just, oh, I'm just gonna stay awake. Don't assume it's just tiredness. And I know you're not doing that. But see if you can develop a relationship with it, like with anything else. Describe it. What kind of tiredness is this? What does it actually feel like? Is it like a wet blanket being thrown on top of you? Is it like white fog drifting across the landscape? What kind of tiredness is this? And then become curious about it. What is this tiredness doing? What's making it come? I have many clients that do this, but one in particular that every time this person pays attention to themselves, it's like this way tiredness comes right over top of them. As though it's saying, don't do that. Don't pay attention to your feelings. It's not safe to even have feelings. This person has been able to relate to the tiredness enough that it can kind of stay off to one side a bit and allow it to access his feelings now. But assume that it's meaningful. What is it doing here? What's this tiredness for? How is it trying to protect me? You can make that assumption and then check and see if it's right. Or if it's not trying to protect you, then what is it scared of? It usually has a meaning. Once you've discovered its meaning, then it usually calms down a bit. or changes into something else, or reveals something that was underneath it. So coming into relationship with it is the fundamental thing. It's being with, like you would be with a client. It's that attitude towards yourself and these different parts of yourself that will come up in order to be paid attention to.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. What else happened or didn't happen? Or do you have questions about?
I'm scanning the room, but one of the things I think resonates, resonates is the simplicity, how simple this approach is. And it reminds me of how simple, not easy, but how simple being with someone in the room in terms of therapy essentially is, I think. And it seems to be this thing that I strive, it's a strange word to use, but strive to achieve, because I think as I've studied and learned through my own practice and my own studies, that it's actually removing the complexity to get to that stillness of simplicity.
Mm-hmm.
that really is so effective in being with the person in the room. And I suppose during that exercise, although I've done things like relaxations and stuff of that kind, so there's some sense of I have some basis of this, but I've never done an exercise like that as such. And what I did notice was that finding where the stresses crept in and where I could release them, if you like. And that sense for me, as I experienced, a sense of expansiveness, which is really simplistic, I suppose, but that word, expansiveness, in terms of my being and connectedness,
Mm-hmm.
and how I often don't allow that
Mm-hmm.
to be part of something I acknowledge or something of my existence, and how that brings in a quality of sadness that I demean that of myself, and that, or disallow that expansive nature and expansiveness that I'm potentially capable of. So that's quite simple.
Yeah.
Not easy, but simple, I think.
Yeah. Can I respond to some of the things you've said?
Yeah.
Okay. The first thing I would say, although in your case, it was useful, but typically if we find something like stress in the body or whatever, we would just stay with it. We're not trying to release anything or change anything. So it's different from relaxation in that respect. In fact, you might be very relaxed until you sit down to focus, and then you might find, oh my goodness, there's this big thing here. So we're not trying to change anything at all. We're just wanting to be with what is. Although I appreciate that expansiveness was important to you. And I know that experience myself too, and it's important to me. And you also felt a little bit of sadness that you don't live in that way more often or something. You didn't quite say it that way. So if we were working together, I would say, well, let's just stay with the sadness for a moment and just let that have a bit of attention, a bit of time. you're right that it has a simplicity to it, because it's natural. It's not some strange technique or something. It is simply paying attention to what's naturally occurring, but that we usually ignore. So if you put it into a therapy session, if you're working in this way, it's because your attention is down in your body. You're feeling yourself from the inside. You're feeling all of your different feelings in the middle of your body, but enough distance from them that you're not overwhelmed or overpowered by them. There's a lot of space inside of you, and you can just have whatever you're feeling. You might be a little bit nervous in front of this particular client or whatever it is. And you're just keeping your own feelings company while you open up to this other person. And this other person, the client, starts telling you a story. Clients usually start with stories. They don't usually start with feelings, but sometimes they do. As the client starts telling you a story, you notice, partly because you're down in your own body resonating, you notice that they have a feeling there that they're not even pausing to pay attention to. They're getting a little bit upset again as they retell this story of what happened that morning or whatever. Because you know how important it is, you can say to the client, it looks like you're feeling it again now, just as you tell me about it. And the client typically will say, yes, I am. I'm pissed off again, just telling you the story. Because you know it's important, you can say to the client, let's just stay with that feeling. You're pissed off. That's an implicit invitation to the client to resonate, to check that word, pissed off. Well, no, it's not that I'm pissed off exactly. It's that I'm frustrated. This is happening all the time, and I've asked him not to do it, and I'm just really frustrated. It happened again this morning. I'm sick of it. As a therapist, you can just reflect that back. So it's more like that. It's like you're sick of it. You're frustrated having to say this over and over, and you're getting sick of that. If it's close enough, the client will tell you more. Every time you reflect it back, if you're on track, the client will add in more, and it just goes back and forth because the client is now not just telling you a story. They're actually starting to explicate the whole experience from the feeling. It's a whole different avenue. You can also say to a client potentially, so you're pissed off, just as you're telling me that again. And the client goes, yeah, I'm pissed off. Well, where do you feel that? Where do you feel that inside? And if the client can say, well, it's like right here in the middle of my chest, it feels tight there. Again, you can say, well, let's just stay with that. Just let yourself feel that for a moment. Most people will pause and feel it for a moment or two. Sometimes a whole new avenue of exploration opens up that they were just kind of telling the story on top of. Something else starts to really happen. And that is very, very useful. If the client is quietly paying attention to it there in their chest, for example, that is not the time to ask them a question or do anything else. That's only a time to encourage them to just stay there. It is, I'm sorry to say, it is very rare for a client to find a therapist who will be quiet at the right moment. So I would encourage you to be that. If a client is paying attention to their experience, that's a great time to just quietly be with them. And you can even say things like, take your time. It's okay with me that you're just sensing into that. No rush, we got lots of time. Just let yourself feel it. It's right there. It's right there. You can say things like that. They just encourage the person to stay with the feeling. Knowing that a feeling knows how to change itself. Given enough time and a kind of open attention, feeling starts to process itself, starts to shift and change as you pay attention to it. You don't need to know the right question to ask. You just need to help the client pay attention to that in themselves, which is trying to live. So you'll just notice for those moments in therapy where something like this can happen. A lot of other things happen in therapy, not just this. But every once in a while where a client is feeling something and not paying attention to it, that's a good time. If you want to work phenomenologically, you're just saying, oh, look, that's there. Can we invite that to be here as well?
I I have some questions. I guess I mean, it's difficult to avoid making comparisons with like other schools, and I'm trying to get rid of the concepts as best as I can. But I guess that's my map or way of relating, and I'm thinking a lot about Bayern, and I guess also I was thinking when you were talking earlier about when Carolina was talking about it being like a co-constituted thing, and then you sort of reflected back that, oh, that's a much more complicated question, and
Sophisticated
sophisticated. There you
and
go.
complicated.
Yeah, you've corrected me. That's good. That's a clarification. But I guess I was thinking that, I mean, it becomes quite complicated, doesn't it? But and probably maybe it's not even worth trying to pin it down. But I guess I was wondering, because I mean, there's something about pace and the way you are, and the way that the speed you're talking at, and the kind of the spaces you're giving that allow things to appear and reveal themselves. And there's something about your sensitivity to picking things up. But as I guess there's something about modeling a way of being. But I was wondering if there's something about your felt sense in the room, and whether you disclose that ever, and how that works. Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't know.
suspect,
It's a murky question, but
no, it's a perfect question, and I suspect you have more questions. But let me answer that one. Just looking at the time. Let me deviate slightly and then come right back to it. I want to deviate because, especially in the existential world, there's a lot of people that know of Gentleman, but don't know him well. And one of the biggest mistakes people make, you're not making this mistake, but the biggest mistake people make is that they think that Gentleman is talking about a feeling as though it's something inside of a person. As though there is such a thing as an inside and an outside. Gentleman wouldn't claim that. He would say the body is very much like Heidegger's Dasein or being in the world. The body is this open system. The body and the environment are one thing. The body is out there in the world. The body is not self-enclosed. The body does not end at the skin. Much more like Merleau-Ponty. You know, we don't start with perception. We don't start with that division. Gentleman used to say to me, show me where the separation is. Show me where the gap is. There is no gap in existence. There's nothing. It's not all one, but it's also not two. There's not a gap somewhere. So that's the beginning of an answer to your question. In therapy, he would say, the two people create each other. And he doesn't mean something abstract and philosophical that you just have to think, oh, that's an interesting thing. I guess I'll agree with that. He means something very concrete. When he talks about the therapeutic relationship, he says the therapeutic relationship is the difference it makes in my body that you're present. As soon as you walk into the room with your therapist, you become a different person. You're already a different person by the time you sit down, and so is the therapist. You and the therapist are not just one, but you're also not two. In some way, you make each other who you can be together. So your question is about self-disclosure. It makes a question of the word self. If I'm disclosing what I'm feeling in the session, what am I actually disclosing? Am I disclosing something about myself? Am I disclosing something about the client? Am I disclosing something about the relationship? Are those three separate things? But you also asked something very concrete, whether I would share what I'm feeling. Whatever it is, I can feel it in my body. From my point of view, what I feel in my body is the session. It's not some self-enclosed me. So I would often share it in a particular way. It would guide what I say to the client. It would guide what I don't say to the client. And I might just say something about what I'm feeling inside with the sense that somehow this is a part of the whole ongoingness between us. If I'm distracted and I'm thinking about buying a new sofa, that's not about my client. But you can discern that pretty easily. If you have a feeling in your body, you can usually tell that this is a feeling of something that's happening here in the room. The feeling in my body is information, not just about me, but about this whole situation that is the two of us in this room. So yeah, I would sometimes find a way of sharing it. I wouldn't shy away from that at all. The other thing I want to say, I know we're coming up to time, is almost the other side of it, is the client's feeling is not, as a lot of theories of therapy keep falling back into, the client's feeling is also not something inside of the client. It's something that the client is aware of potentially, but it somehow is directed towards the world. It somehow is, it's an action tendency. It's something about the world. It's not just about them. So if the client has a feeling and I'm there in the room, in some sense, even though it's not about me, it might be about their mother or father or something. In some sense, in that moment, it is towards me. If I can allow myself to be impacted and affected by the client's feeling, I allow that feeling to continue to be processed. To some extent, the client's feeling is also processed through my body because it's not separate from the client. So paying attention to my body and sharing some of what's going on for me sometimes is really important. It can be the further end of the client's feeling process. Sounds bizarre, but I think in keeping with existential philosophy, this is a practice I think that actually follows very much from the philosophy. Even though it's not meant to be that. It doesn't come from the philosophy, it comes from just living, from life, purely empirical. And the Jennings philosophy comes from what he learned from this, paying attention to this aspect of what a human being is. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. That was great. Thank you. I could ask more, but
Yeah, I know. I can get that sense. Thank you. Should we see if there's one more or should we end there?
Let's see if there's one more. How about that? Is that okay? Does anyone want to say or ask further? Okay. I see no hands or.
I think George did just put his hand up.
Oh, well, okay.
It's up to you if you don't.
Are we? Awa. Thank you so much, Greg. Oh, sorry, it's gone. Chat.
So let's
thank you so much, Greg, for the amazing presentation, and thank you everyone for sharing. Unfortunately, I have to go to my baby. I have to go. My baby needs me. Thanks, Awa.
So let's wait just 1 second. If there's anything that is sitting with anyone and it's in there kind of going, see if you want to ask it. And if you don't, there's one thing I want to say, and then we can call it a night. But just take a second and check. Yes.
So if you spend a lot of your life being moved, you, Greg, if you spend a lot of your life being receptive and being really moved at that deepest sense of the word by other people, by clients, by people that you meet. How do you cope with that? How do you keep yourself healthy, safe? If yeah.
I find that's a good question, and it comes up quite often. I find this way of working gives me a lot more energy. It doesn't tire me out because I'm just really giving space to whatever's there in my client, in me, in the relationship. And I can feel myself being changed and elaborated as a person with every single person I meet. Every relationship implies change. So I'm deeply changed by all the clients I work with and just everybody that I meet. It's not a burden. It doesn't feel like a burden. It feels just like I become a more complicated aspect of the universe at large. So yeah, this way of working is itself a method of self-care, I would say. In between clients, what I do is I've got 10 minutes before the next client. I write my notes in a way that I'm just kind of clearing a little bit of space inside of me. I'm writing down what's alive in me from working with that person and just putting it down on like a couple of sentences until I feel like, okay, now I've got a bit more space now. I'm ready for the next person. And then I don't hold on to it. I know the change happens in the other person. It doesn't happen in me holding on to it. And it continues to happen after the session. They go out of the room or offline, continuing to live whatever was made a little bit more alive. Okay. The last thing I want to just say is I'm not interested in selling focusing. I don't really make any money from it. It's not, I get nothing from you becoming focusing practitioners or something. But I would encourage you, if you want to be existential therapists, I would encourage you to look at this way of working, because I don't know how you can be existential and not do something like this. If you want to work phenomenologically, you have to be open to a whole person, to their whole being, whole process, to what a whole person is, and live with the question of that. I don't know what a person is, but I recognize one when I see one. So if you're curious, the Focusing Institute, focusing.org, there's the Gendlin online library, and there's a lot of his writing all the way back to the 50s, full text articles on philosophy, psychotherapy, all sorts of things that you can download for free. There's also a couple of YouTube channels on focusing-oriented therapy and little clips of Gendlin talking about philosophy or about this way of working. You can find a lot of it online. You can see if you're interested in knowing more or not, but you can find enough that you can begin to get a really good sense of what he was pointing to in his writing. Yeah. See what resonates and what doesn't. And if it doesn't resonate, I would encourage you, don't believe it. Okay. Thank you.